Friday, 31st of August 1888. It was 3:45 a.m. in Whitechapel, London, and a policeman moving around the neighbourhood spots someone lying on the ground. Clutching his oil lamp, he moves closer to inspect the figure. It is still pitch black, and without bright street lamps, he has to get closer to check on the person. Instead of finding someone sleeping on the ground, he comes across a woman. Her throat has been cut, and her body is still warm to the touch. Immediately, the policeman raises the alarm and a doctor shows to investigate the body. She has been dead for roughly 30 minutes, and blood pooling around her body suggests that she has bled to death. The main arteries in her neck have been cut from behind, as though the killer wanted her to die quickly, covered in her own blood. He could have snuck up and ambushed the defenceless woman, but that determination will have to wait until autopsy. Once the doctor leaves, people begin to gather around the crime scene, and the London media jump onto the scene, eager for details of the horrific murder. The crime would mark the beginning of a murder spree that horrified the nation and continues to remain probably the most well-known serial killer case of all time. This is the case of the Whitechapel murderer, most commonly known as Jack the Ripper. I hope you enjoy. With such grisly wounds, the body of the murdered woman now resided at the local morgue. Adding to the gruesome neck wounds were facial bruising caused by the offender's thumb and deep abdomen cuts, as if the killer was trying to remove the organs of the victim. Everyone was shocked by the savage nature of the crime. However, in a working class area like Whitechapel, murder wasn't all that uncommon, and women were easy targets for dangerous predators, especially women walking alone at night. As it would turn out, many of Jack the Ripper's victims had either been homeless, living on the street, or had been residing at workhouses where the conditions were dirty and unsafe. This communal setting had been put in place because many people could not afford any type of living space. Many of the Ripper's victims had actually come from loving homes, but fell victim to the brutal reality of London's East End, whether that be because their partner sadly passed away or they became addicted to alcohol. Both were big causes of homelessness and despair for women at the time. In the 1880s, London's East End was essentially a melting pot of people from all over the world, a rough environment where many drank to cope with the bleak reality of working class living. The class divides back then were very visible, and the news story of this brutal murder would create a media storm of sensationalism for those from different social classes to read about, a story that has continued even to this day, with many questions that likely may never be answered. The victim whose murder spawned the Jack the Ripper murders was named as Mary Ann Nichols, who went by the nickname Polly. Polly wasn't your typical Whitechapel woman. She had been part of a very tight-knit family and had even attended school when she was younger. This was an anomaly for the Victorian era, as school required payment and girls typically weren't favoured to attend school like their male counterparts. Polly had married at age 18 and followed Victorian tradition, but somewhere along the line she began drinking. Her drinking habit culminated in the breakdown of her marriage, and she eventually separated from her partner. Now alone and living at a workhouse, she had to depend on herself to survive. Unfortunately, Polly became the first confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper. The murder of Polly is an interesting one that tells a lot about the offender. The fact that he specifically cut the carotid arteries indicate that he was familiar with killing, as though he's had some experience. The amount of blood that would have been present from doing this is huge. It's something that many other serial killers wouldn't find appealing. This murder method could imply that the killer had at some point worked for a local butchering company and was comfortable with blood. As mentioned, the media jumped on the story immediately. The Victorian era was a time when crime was popular, and in fact not long before the Ripper murders, Sherlock Holmes had become a popular source of entertainment for wealthy Londoners. This was the time when crime and detective stories were very commonplace, and everyone wanted in on the action. From the consumer to the creator, everyone was cashing in their own way. From the start, the Jack the Ripper press coverage was making money, and he hadn't even been given his nickname yet. The police and media journalists were fighting against one another at this time. They weren't on friendly terms, and this was highlighted by the contrasting version of events and sensationalism in the case. Back in the 1880s, it was more of a race to get the attention of the reader. Actually, that sounds identical to what goes on today, although it was done a little differently. The media just straight up gave the entirety of the murder. Everyone would have known the cause of death, plus the gory details. The headline language used was designed to strike fear into the population and keep them buying more newspapers. An example of this was shown in this case. Another woman found horribly murdered in Whitechapel, ghastly crimes by a maniac. Given the Whitechapel area being poor, run down, and not a desirable place to live, Polly was viewed and treated with far less dignity than other murder victims. She was labelled as a prostitute by the media, despite there being no evidence for her even being one, and within no time the case went dry, with no leads as to who her killer was. As the media continued printing out more graphic coverage of the murder, 8 days later and another murdered woman was found. Again, the murder had taken place in Whitechapel, and this time it was half a mile from the last crime scene. Police arrived on the scene, and already a large crowd had circled the body to take a look, peeking closer to observe the carnage, shooing the crowd away so that they could preserve some evidence. The reality of the severity of the case hit officers immediately. A mutilated female in a pool of blood was lying next to a stacked pile of her own personal items. The woman's name was Annie Chapman, and like Polly, she was from a decent family. She grew up educated and eventually became a servant. As expected with Victorian tradition, Annie married, and the photograph of her and her husband expressed the status that she once held. Despite holding a fairly respectable position in Victorian society, tragedy unexpectedly arrived. Annie's husband died from alcoholism, and Annie herself eventually became an alcoholic. Many people drank alcohol, especially gin at this time. Gin was known as Old Mother's Ruin, and the name really says it all. Alcohol really impacted the entire Victorian society, and Annie, it would emerge, had last been seen wandering the streets, completely drunk according to eyewitnesses. Much like with Polly's murder, the coverage of Annie's case was near enough identical. She was labelled as a sex worker and given her new place in society. It was easy for her to be seen as an unfortunate. Now at 2 murders in such a small time frame and vicinity, wealthy folk actually began dressing up in typical working class clothing and paid a visit to the crime scenes. This was a classic example, and probably one of the first examples, of morbid tourism. Much like with public hangings, everyone pulled up to have a fun day out. Street vendors noticed the business opportunities and began setting up food stalls, and so you could have a snack while strolling around the neighbourhood. And just remember, these tourists would have read about how Annie's uterus had been removed in the newspaper, before walking little Otto and Florence around Whitechapel for a day of excitement. How messed up is that? And that mutilation difference made this killer of women stand out. He was evolving, and his signature was becoming clearer. He was mutilating the women's bodies for personal pleasure, probably of a sexual nature. 3 weeks later, and in a similar play of events, a large crowd huddled around another lifeless woman's body and had police alerted to the crime scene. Once again, all the hallmarks of the same killer were present, from the cutthroat to the location. However, witness statements offered a glimpse toward a promising progression for the case. One of the eyewitnesses saw someone who was thought to be the killer, wearing a deerstalker hat. It was out of place for Whitechapel and would have easily helped conceal his identity. The problem with this and the other eyewitness descriptions though, was that it was yet again early in the morning. The darkness aided Jack the Ripper throughout his spree, and so the eyewitness sightings weren't all that reliable. They were mostly vague, and nobody got a good look at the culprit's face to pick up on any distinct facial characteristics. The murdered woman was soon named as Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth was a Swedish immigrant who had been booted from Sweden following the discovery that she had early warning signs of syphilis. Swedish policy demanded those with venereal diseases isolate in camps and go through pretty horrific treatment, which included applying caustic chemicals to your private regions. Safe to say that these didn't do anything but cause more pain, misery and suffering. Elizabeth got out of Sweden and made it to London. She was now alone and spent her time committing small cons, one of these telling false stories of how she'd survived a boat crash on the River Thames. Elizabeth garnered sympathy and money from those who she told these tales to, and this enabled her to survive on the streets. In a cruel twist of fate, Elizabeth was now having stories told about her. Media claimed once again that Elizabeth was also working the streets as a sex worker. An hour following the discovery of Elizabeth's body, and yet again, another mutilated female turned up in Whitechapel. Catherine Eddowes was laying in a pool of blood. Her abdomen was cut open, and it would surface that Catherine was living a transient lifestyle, residing on the streets. Catherine was missing a corset, and in Victorian society, that was something that was frowned upon. Women were expected to be prim and proper, and to be wearing a corset. The corset was seen as an item of clothing that indicated that you had morals and social standing. Without it as a woman, you weren't deemed all that respectable. Catherine had been released from the local jail following being picked up for being drunk. She had been freed not long prior to being murdered, and the killer had mutilated her corpse. He'd removed her uterus like he did with his previous victim Annie, and this time he went even further. He took her kidney. Police were now baffled, and the public were fearful of becoming victims given the news headlines and the cravings for blood that this killer exhibited. It would be a couple of days later that a letter made its way to some journalists who had been covering the 3 murder cases. Titled The Letter from Hell, the letter claimed to be from the killer, and in the typical serial killer style, he said that he'd never stop killing. The writer called himself Jack the Ripper. The publishing of the letter and its contents probably caused a local vigilante group to form within Whitechapel because this really freaked out local residents. The police were nowhere near to catching Jack the Ripper, and the local Whitechapel vigilantes routinely patrolled the area and vowed to capture the killer before the police. Now, when you have vigilante groups getting involved, it really shows just how terrified everyone is. I feel like the media sensationalism caused a mass panic in Whitechapel, and if the letter from hell had been from the killer, then he was probably watching with a huge smirk on his face. In mid-October 1888, the head of the Community Vigilance Group opened a package on his doorstep. It was half a human kidney in bloody tissue paper. It's easy to say that this could have been from the killer, but back in the day, getting a hold of a human kidney wasn't all that difficult. This was the time that surgery, dissection and medicine were beginning to pick up steam, and you could get internal human organs from newly deceased criminals or unclaimed bodies. Since there was no ability to compare DNA back then, there was no definitive proof that this kidney even belonged to Catherine. The case drew even more publicity because of the whole kidney package. But just who was the killer? The 1880s were not only the time of Sherlock Holmes, but also the time of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This widened the belief by the public that the killer may be from a higher class and was targeting lower class women as they made for easier targets. The split personality theory exhibited in Jekyll and Hyde went so far as to when the story was shown on stage in London's West End, someone in the audience even reported the actor to the police as Jack the Ripper. This involvement and speculation by the public made everyone a suspect. You could be at the lowest or highest end of society. The suspect could be in the royal family, or he could be an alcoholic homeless man. Everyone was interested in the case, and everyone was sending in their own tips to help capture the killer. Clearly, these didn't help the investigation. The final murder attributed to Jack the Ripper came on the 9th of November 1888. 2 men collecting neighbourhood rent knocked on the door at the home of Mary Jane Kelly, an attractive woman of Irish descent. When Mary didn't answer, the 2 men peeked into the window and saw a gruesome sight. Police were alerted and kicked in the door. What they found shocked them. Like that scene from Terrifier 2, Mary was practically unrecognisable. The killer had cut her throat, face, and essentially her entire body. Most of her organs were missing, and nobody could tell how the killer had got into her house, whether he had been invited inside or forced his way in. Mary had been involved in sex work, and police queried her partner about her murder. It's unlikely that he was involved, and it looked as though Jack the Ripper had struck again. Over 2,000 interviews were conducted by police at the time, and even though more than 300 people were investigated, nobody was ever formally charged with the 5 murders. To this day, this case remains a mystery. Suspects have cropped up over the years, but most of the time, the evidence against them is circumstantial at best. The Jack the Ripper case is certainly a tragic one, as the 5 women each fell victim to him, despite many of them coming from solid family units. It's a shame that this case was never closed. But despite this result, it has aided law enforcement around the world when it comes to understanding serial murder and offender behaviour. And since that time, the police and journalist relations have improved significantly. No longer in competition, they have mostly come together in order to raise case awareness and help bring killers to justice. This has been the case of Jack the Ripper. As always, thank you for watching.